The following video will revolve around excerpts from Wekker's book on White Innocence. Specifically, we will elaborate on Wekker's concept of white innocence itself and her concept of the burden of skin color. Wekker refers to white innocence as showing how the denial of racism and the expression of innocence safeguards white privilege. We will break down Wekker's statement pertaining to white innocence in two parts. In the first part of this video, we will address white innocence by discussing a modern-day example of how whites unconsciously racially discriminate towards non-whites. We will introduce this section by means of a short clip that we feel delineates the underlying concept present in this section, namely implicit bias. In the second part, we will elaborate on the burden of skin color created by the discriminatory practices that result from the white innocence laid out in the previous section. We chose to cover Wekker's text in particular because we wanted to expand on her text in terms of ethnicities and countries covered, as Wekker's text predominantly focuses on African American racial discrimination in the Netherlands, namely through Zwarte Piet. The idea described by Wekker, however, has a much larger scope and is relevant on a global scale. We will touch upon this global character by delineating US, Chinese, and Somali examples of white innocence and the burden of skin color. The following clip will delineate an underlying concept relevant for our first claim, namely implicit bias. As part of our video, we will discuss two claims. The first claim we will discuss is: U.S. police misconduct geared towards Black and Hispanic people is an example of racial discrimination through implicit bias and relates to Wekker's concept of white innocence. The second claim we'll discuss in our video is: the effect of white innocence is so severe that people aspire to be white to gain a level of power and privilege in the social hierarchy. Now, as part of this claim, we'll be focusing on Chinese culture beauty standards, in which white is associated with prestige and higher social standard. Hereafter, we will zoom in on African culture beauty standards, in which white is considered the ambassador of beauty. We would like to commence our first claim by linking Gloria Wekker's text's concept, white innocence, to a contemporary phenomenon that is, above all, prevalent in the United States. One could perhaps consider it the US equivalent of what happens with the Dutch Zwarte Piet, police misconduct geared towards Blacks and Hispanics. To be specific, the misconduct we'll be focusing on revolves around the war on drugs and refers to police officers stopping and frisking Black and Hispanic people without any proper grounds of justification. Over the past decade, unfair stop and frisk tactics used to combat the war on drugs have been a dominant news topic in the United States. Countless news reports and research papers have asserted that, in carrying out these stop and frisk tactics, the U.S. police confines itself to very specific groups, Blacks and Hispanics. Data from New York between the years 2000 and 2014 reveal that the use of stop and frisk tactics towards Blacks and Hispanics has once again increased. Strikingly, though, different research reveals that middle and upper class whites use more drugs, thus suggesting that the focus should, if anything, be on the whites. As concrete data fail to support the U.S. police force's targeting of Blacks and Hispanics in combating the war on drugs, it is evident that unfounded discriminatory motives are at play. As the perpetrators of discrimination, in this case U.S. police officers, continue to insist that, in largely confining themselves to the stopping and frisking of Blacks and Hispanics, they are simply doing their job and acting upon reasonable suspicions that these Blacks or Hispanics or Hispanic individuals are indeed engaging in criminal activities related to drugs. It is precisely this attitude that perfectly relates to what Wekker describes as the denial of racism and the expression of innocence. Indeed, the police officers refuse to admit that their undeniable tendency to only pay attention to Blacks and Hispanics in the war on drugs is in fact owed to racism. As Wekker repeatedly emphasizes in her text, perpetrators of discrimination are often unaware of their racist attitudes and behavior. It is very likely that the police officers' racist attitudes are also implicit, as shown in the clip. Upon first sight, one may feel that explicit racism is more problematic and harmful. We would, however, argue that quite the opposite is true. As long as perpetrators of racial discrimination are unaware of their discriminatory practices, they will not feel the need to change, as, in their view, there was never a reason to want to incite this change in the first place. Thus, as long as there is denial, there will be no progress. And in the long run, as Wekker points out using the example of Zwarte Piet, it is precisely this that drives white privilege to endure at the expense of non-whites. In the next section, we will elaborate on this detriment suffered by non-whites and how it manifests itself in their daily lives.
We would like to start our second claim by linking Wekker's concept of white innocence to the impact that white privilege has in the world as we know it today. The perspectives we chose reflect the burden of skin color, a concept explained by Wekker. With two examples provided, we will discuss how lighter skin is associated with prestige and a higher level of economic and social standard in different cultural perspectives, namely in the Chinese and the African one. We will show that the consequences of white privilege do not necessarily originate from colonialism, as becomes clear when discussing our Chinese perspective. Furthermore, we will see that the history of segregation and white supremacy still has an effect on the African cultural perspective. Finally, we believe these two perspectives give a different view since they are more internationally orientated. The burden of skin color according to the Chinese perspective. The beauty standards in Asia are different and unrelated to the ones in Western countries. According to the Chinese beauty standards, the whiter men and women are, the more social prestige they gain and the higher they are perceived on the hierarchy of social status. People from the south of China are usually more tanned and have a darker skin color. But the darker you are, the lower you are considered to be on a social status. The thought behind this originated from the Han Dynasty. The belief behind it is that the color of one's skin was reflective of their elite status. Having pale skin shows that you had the luxury of having the ability to relax indoors instead of working in the fields outside. On a sunny day, both men and women walked around with umbrellas in order to avoid getting a tan from the sun. This shows that they want to preserve their white skin color as much as possible. Another example to illustrate the burden of skin color in China is the use of whitening face masks. The Chinese spend lots of money on face masks that are supposed to lighten your skin color. The purchase of skin whiteners can signify women's individual financial power, as well as their potential to provide for the family, a responsibility that traditionally reserved for the male members of the family. This is an example of how white privilege is indoctrinated in Chinese mindset without it being related to the history of colonialism. Furthermore, the emphasis on a fair complexion can be found in ancient proverbs and writings. In ancient Chinese literature, attractive women were often described by likening their skin to that of snow, ice, or jade. These analogies demonstrated qualities of transparency, delicacy, smoothness, and whiteness. The Chinese proverbs also reiterate the concept of whiteness as protection. These literary connections between beauty and whiteness suggest that the shades of one's skin has played a historically significant role in Chinese society. The African perspective. Skin bleaching, also called lightening or whitening, is seen as a standard procedure in many African countries. Some might say that skin bleaching is a nasty consequence of colonialism. These European countries were flooding their colonial places with their products and using whiteness as a way to sell the products. People were, therefore, attempting to gain some level of power and privilege that's associated with whiteness. A part of Somalia was colonized by Italy. The Italians used to live mainly in Mogadishu and owned several neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods were off limits for the original inhabitants, which symbolized the concept of segregation. The Somalis would see the Italian way of life and therefore strive to be a part of that lifestyle. In order to gain some significance in their lifestyle, the Somalis would aspire to be white as they associated their lifestyle with whiteness. Skin bleaching has impacted Africans' individual and collective beauty standards. Lighter skin is often perceived as a marker of superior beauty and economic status. Just before a big event such as a wedding in Somalia, women are swapping recommendations for skin lightening products or give directions to beauticians. Thinking back to my holiday in Somalia, the question, "What are you using?" was a common phrase heard in women's conversation. Moreover, women will try their best to avoid contact with the sun as much as possible. They evade the sun by, for example, putting on face masks or not even going outside when the sun is at its highest. I remember that my aunties would recommend me to stay inside between 12 p.m. and 4 p.m. This is a common practice in Somalia, as the streets are empty in the specific time period. Light skin, white skin is still considered the ambassador of beauty. There is no health benefit to skin bleaching. Results are not guaranteed, and there is evidence that skin lightening can result in serious side effects and complications for your health. Women all over the world are still using skin bleaching products despite numerous researches indicating the high health risks of these products. Let them live in active solidarity or without having to carry the burden of their skin color, thus without white innocence. A quote from Wekker. She emphasizes in her text that black people should live in active solidarity and without having to carry the burden of their skin color. As you saw in the Chinese perspective, lighter skin is associated with prestige and a higher social status. The African perspective presents the same view with regard to a higher social status, but in Africa there's more a sense of looking up to and aspiring to become part of a white community. We have tried to expand Wekker's perspective on white innocence and the burden of skin color. Wekker focuses on discrimination against black people in the Netherlands. Our attempt to go even further than Wekker's example constituted of two concepts. In our first concept, we used police brutality to clarify that as long as people do not recognize or deny that implicit racism is real and as problematic and harmful as explicit racism, there would be no progress. In our second concept, we have used different global perspectives to illustrate the fact that white skin color is associated with a higher social status and prestige, which eventually leads to people using different methods to assume a lighter skin tone as they aspire to become part of a white community.